Thank you for coming this afternoon. And as you can see, we're going to talk about prairie restoration. And the speaker I know is well known to y'all that live here in Bell County because he is a member of the Tonkawa chapter. So please welcome Cullom Simpson with Texas Parks and Wildlife.
Thank you, Laura. So y'all bear with me. So I'm Cullom Simpson. I'm the biologist for Bell and Williamson County for Parks and Wildlife. My primary role is working with landowners. Doesn't matter what size of property they have. Also working with county, city, federal government agencies on their lands, providing public hunting, habitat management practices. So we're going to talk about grassland management and restoration from beginning to end. It's a pun on words. There is no end, all right? So don't think that we're going to go from A to Z and you'll be done, right? So we're going to get started. I said bear with me. So grasslands, depending on where you are, they're known as grasslands, prairies, pampas, steppes, savannas. It all equals land dominated by grass. Grasslands are found between forest and deserts, found on every continent but Antarctica. So in Texas, they have a fairly diverse representation from alpine to East Texas piney woods, Tyler, right? So very different plant communities, but they're all classified as grasslands. Even within Texas, they're found between forest and deserts. Forests are on the east side of Texas, deserts are on the west. Across that range, the threats to these grasslands are largely the same. Development, brush encroachment, overgrazing, exotic grasses. So we all know that Texas is broken up into ecoregions, and within each of those ecoregions, grasslands have a different look. And so primarily I work within the Edwards Plateau, Blackland Prairies, and Post Oak Savanna ecoregions, which is kind of unique for this area. So we're in Salado. So if you go to the west of Salado, you'll see the Edwards Plateau. If you go to the east of 35, you'll see the Blackland Prairie. And if you keep going to the east, you'll get into the Post Oak Savanna. So we're very centrally located across 3 different ecoregions. And so this picture on the left demonstrates the hill country here. You have 35 and Prairiedale, and immediately down to the east is Blackland Prairie. A very stark difference and contrast in ecoregions as you move from west to east. Let's see. All right, I'm going the same direction. All right, so what does all that mean? So the landscape is a patchwork of habitat types. Grasslands represent a portion of that habitat type. That continuum of vegetation is called succession. So succession is as the landscape moves from grasslands to woodlands and kind of that process. View the landscape from the 30,000 foot view and think of a quilt. Grasslands are a portion or one patch of that quilt. So they host a wide variety of plants and animals, help increase clean water, provide carbon storage, help maintain soil health through extensive root structures that improve infiltration and reduce erosion. So one of the magic of grasslands is not necessarily above ground that you can see, but it's below ground. And so in healthy grasslands, there are some plants that have roots that are 5 to 8 feet tall down into the ground. And so a lot of the life is what you can't see. So we talked about succession. So succession is kind of this continuum. Think bare ground to woods. Grasslands is kind of in the middle. Those disturbances that set succession back can be man-made, such as a bulldozer or natural like wildfire. A lot of Texas is moving towards a woodland state. We talked about brush encroachment being a threat to grassland management. So you've got mesquite or ash juniper or yopon or cedar elm or hackberry, some sort of woody species is encroaching and turning that once grassland into a woodland. So on the landscape, how many of y'all are familiar with state and transition models? Okay, so this is very academic. So across the landscape, there's ecological site descriptions that basically gives the plants that are representative to a site. So these state and transition models basically say, here's a grassland, here are the threats to that grassland. So in this example, we have savanna, shrubland, and woodland. So in time, that grassland's going to move to a shrubland and then a woodland if nothing's done to it. We also have kind of this other category, which is when we've converted grasslands to non-native monoculture plants, say Bermuda grass, KR bluestem, think hay pastures. And so this kind of represents that kind of conundrum across the landscape that grasslands are in. And so when you drive across the landscape, if you think about what you're looking at, probably what you're looking at can fit somewhere in these boxes. If you do have a savanna, that's a functionally healthy grassland. Most of the time, we're going to be somewhere shrubland to woodland, and then a lot of the times we're going to be completely out of that natural system and in the converted area. And so when we're working in that system where we have savannas, shrubland, and woodlands, we can implement Aldo Leopold's 5 tools to manage those systems back to that savanna system. So if we have a woodland, we can use the axe to take it back to a savanna. If we have a grassland that's becoming maybe a little bit too rich in grasses and we want to improve diversity, we can use the cow. If we want to start over, say we're in South Texas where we have brushland, we can use the plow through root plowing to get rid of all the woodies to completely start over to get it back to a savanna. In most situations, you can use fire to get it from a woodland or a shrubland back to savanna. And then several of y'all mentioned y'all are from the hill country, so we have these lovely animals called axis, or just exotics in general, that we need to control to help maintain. And so with this series of tools, we can take a woodland or a shrubland and convert it back to a savanna. These tools were basically the tools that were also used to destroy our grasslands. So think we didn't cut trees, right? Maybe we overgrazed, maybe we plowed too much, we suppressed fire, and we didn't harvest. So the same tools that created or destroyed, we can use to restore. So when you're looking at a grassland and you're thinking about that succession and that disturbance continuum, it's an ever-changing patchwork of disturbances. So it's not generally idle. So it can be burned, grazed. Can everybody burn or graze a property? No. They can also what? Mow. Okay? They can be thinned, burned, and grazed and mowed. And then there's also going to be areas that are untouched for a period of time, but eventually they're going to have some sort of disturbance that is going to set them back to become a grassland. So when we're implementing these practices, you don't just implement them and they just work. A lot of times it's implementing them, you're seeing how it works, and you're improvising and adapting. And so one of the biggest management practices that people don't think about is time, patience. It can take years for management activities to show results. Working with landowners, time is a big thing. A lot of people are busy now, they want things to be immediate, and sometimes it just can't go that way. You're also trying to to get your management practices to last as long as possible. And so while we may go in and remove some of these woody species, we're not going to just be able to say, okay, we removed them and walk away. You're going to remove them, and then you're going to follow up to that initial removal to kind of get the most time out of your effort. So a lot of folks, when they're looking at implementing these management practices, let's just say we've gone in and we've cleared a woods to create, go from woodlands back to savannas, the question comes up, should we reseed? So we all know that native seed is fairly available, but it does cost money. So it's site specific. I had a supervisor when I was in undergraduate school that would always say there's no need to seed native rangeland. There is seed in the seed bank. It's just a matter of being patient. It's also scale dependent. Can we seed a couple acres, or are we going to be seeding 100 acres? Which one's more realistic? If you're impatient, maybe you do want to seed to try to increase that response. And then, of course, it always depends on your economics. And so this picture to the left, this would represent a project this past year. They had gone in and removed a bunch of ash juniper on kind of an oak woodland savanna. And this landowner wanted to seed, even though he had pretty good amount of vegetation coming back after he had done his clearing, he still wanted to seed to try to expedite that response. And so it can be useful. Is it needed? Not always. So reseeding can look like a variety of things. It can look like propagation, where you're going out and picking seed in the fall on your own, and you're planting them on your own, or you're just putting out that seed, which would be kind of the rake and boot, where you're taking a rake, you're putting the seed down, and you're putting the ground with your boots. Using a hand spreader, like you're going to spray the Scott's fertilizer in your yard. It can be a UTV-driven spreader, or kind of what everybody thinks about is like a no-till seed drill, which is generally used for larger areas. All of these are kind of scale dependent. As a project site gets larger, you're going to move to more mechanical, automated tools, such as the seed drill. Again, it's okay not to seed and let nature take its course. It's really interesting when you're meeting with landowners and you tell them, hey, I think this is in a good state. Your recovery is coming along perfect. I don't think you need to seed. They get really depressed. And it's like, no, that's a good thing. That means you're not at a state where we need to seed to get things to go in the right direction. That's a good thing. For whatever reason, they get kind of takes the wind out of their sails. And so here's a landowner that I met with down south of San Antonio. This was kind of his initial start to his prairie restoration project. He gathered some plants along the bar ditch, planted them in his native prairie growing. Here it is following his planting. And then this would represent some seed that he's been able to gather off of his own plantings. And so that's kind of a really basic way to start your own native prairie, whether it's 1 acre or 10 acres, is doing this. And my wife and I, we've been picking seed already, side oats grama, big blue stem, they're ready. And so really fun, easy activity if you like to be outside. So again, threats to grassland systems: development, brush encroachment, overgrazing by livestock, exotic grasses. In my role, this one is a hard needle to move. These others I can work with landowners on. And so we focus on that. So something to think about, always keep in mind, why are we managing grasslands? So this would be bare ground, this is woods. We're trying to keep plants or grasslands right here. If we don't manage them, they're going to become woodlands. So as you're driving across Texas and you see grasslands, are all grasslands created equal? No, right? So on the left, we have a field full of old world bluestem. Is that going to provide benefit to wildlife, pollinators? Maybe, right? Maybe a little bit. If you're observant, you'll see a road edge that has native plants on it. So this is in the fall, big bluestem, oregano. There's some Maximilian sunflower in there, adjacent to a field of Bermuda grass. So now we're starting to see the difference between kind of that cultivated land versus that natural land versus a native prairie that's been restored. And now we're seeing kind of that native plant, those native plants express themselves. So we might be providing more benefit to wildlife and pollinators and water and erosion reduction. So as you're driving around, I'm always driving around and taking pictures of fence lines. It's always interesting to look at what's gone on from the bar ditch to inside the fence or adjacent on a different landowners. Really kind of allows you to see how those management practices impact the vegetation. So here's some examples. So this is outside of Salado, just west of here. So we have little bluestem, big bluestem, some croton, next to some Bermuda grass pasture. So we can kind of see that stark difference. This is over near Bertram, native grass, maybe a little heavy grazing pressure. So you can kind of see these differences, and it's pretty amazing how much when you drive around, you're seeing this continuum when you're driving around. I mean, it's pretty amazing. And so, do we want this or do we want this? It depends on your goals, ultimately. But this can probably provide the same examples as the improved pasture, and we get the benefits to wildlife and pollinators. So these improved pastures kind of provide some conservation opportunity through some cost share programs. And so Parks and Wildlife has a program that's through the Partners Program for Fish and Wildlife Service called PUB, or Pastures for Upland Game Birds. And this program focuses specifically on turning improved grass pastures back to native pastures. It's been in existence for 12 to 15 years, started more in East Texas, and to date there's been projects take place in 80 counties, 250 projects for a little more than 13,000 acres. And so this has provided landowners a significant opportunity to try to convert improved grass pastures back to native grass pastures. And so we're going to kind of look at some of that process that goes on with this program. So we talked a little bit about improved grass pastures. One of the reasons that they're planted is because they are more resistant to heavy grazing, but they do form monocultures, oftentimes have less diversity, less desirable for wildlife. But I will say that in a combination where you have improved grass or non-native grass pastures and native grass pastures, they can be beneficial in providing a sacrifice pasture so that you can graze and manage your native grasses as they need to be managed. But when we get into a drought, we can put livestock into the improved grass pastures. So there can be a benefit there. But I'm a native grass person, and so I'm going to side with native grass. One of the reasons that native grass pastures are often converted to improved grass pastures is they are sensitive to heavy grazing. A lot of our warm season natives are what we call decreasers. So under heavy grazing pressure, they decrease. A lot of our improved grasses or lesser quality grasses are what we call increasers. The more you graze them, the more they increase. When livestock graze, think about having ice cream and cottage cheese. They're going to eat all the ice cream before the cottage cheese. And so when they eat all the ice cream, it goes away. then they move on to the cottage cheese. And so that's kind of why they call them increasers versus decreasers. Y'all are native plant people. We all know the benefits of native plants. Bunch grasses provide bare ground for small wildlife to maneuver. Forbs occur in this bare ground, and it provides food and shelter for wildlife. And so you can see kind of some more of these fence line contrast photos. For whatever reason, that's very appeasing for me to see those differences, and I think it provides a good example for y'all. And so what does it take to take a completely cultivated, non-native pasture back to natives? Well, it's a process that requires a plan with specific goals and objectives to meet those goals. One of the things that I have to communicate with landowners is this is not a 1-year process, a 2-year process, or a 3-year process. This is kind of a lifelong journey that has a few bumps. And so one of the things that you're going to see in this presentation are series of photo points where we have taken non-native grass pastures back to native. And so that's kind of a way of monitoring that process. And so we'll keep going. So non-native improved grasses can be viewed as a cancer on the landscape that need a little bit of chemotherapy, and that's herbicide to be converted to native grasses. You can plant native plants into these exotic grass pastures without using herbicide, but your success won't be as long-lived and could be very futile. We use herbicides to set the plant community back to zero, to then try to give those native plants an opportunity at being successful. And for the most part, when I say herbicide, we're using Roundup. We're using glyphosate, Roundup, to convert these pastures. And so when we're doing these projects, it's really important to have realistic expectations. We're trying to improve the diversity of these sites, but realistically, they'll always have these exotic grasses. You know, oftentimes we're doing 20 to 100 acres, and surrounding that property is exotic grass. So it's going to come in. We're just trying to improve that diversity. So how? So old world blue stems, Bermuda grass, Klein grass, Johnson grass, Bahia grass, very common improved grasses that are planted for grazing or for hay. Generally, we're going to, those vegetation or the species, when they grow, they have a large thatch bed. And so when we're starting our project, we want to try and get that thatch bed to zero, which would mean mow, hay, graze, burn, disc, or a combination to kind of reduce that thatch and get that growth down to zero, but then also get that plant growing again. Once we get a little bit of herbicide on the ground, we're going to apply 3.3 quarts of Roundup in May, June, and again in August, September to make that landscape zero. Go ahead. So the question was, when I said stimulate growth, what are we trying to stimulate growth? So we're trying to stimulate growth of our target plant that we're trying to remove. And so the reason is that when we apply herbicide, we want that plant actively growing and taking in moisture. And so when we stimulate it, it's prodding it to grow. And so that helps our herbicide be more effective. Does that make sense? Okay. So we're going to apply herbicide in May, June, August, September to get that site to zero. We may burn it to try to remove some of that thatch. This is a very much a scalpel approach. So it's a plan with specific objectives to meet a goal. A lot of people, when you first talk about this, they think, oh my goodness, you're applying herbicide. It's to meet a specific goal. So moving on, herbicide application. It's concentrated application to accomplish a certain set of goals. Native plants will grow back after being sprayed. So these top three photos are from projects that I have going on right now. And when I went out there in July, in between our sprayings, you have Maximilian sunflower, antelope horn milkweed, and green milkweed growing in that area that was sprayed by herbicide. So that landscape was sprayed, everything died, and in between one herbicide spraying to another, you had those plants come up. So there can be life even after herbicide. And yes, you know, when you're talking about landowners, talking with landowners about this process, that site's going to look fairly dead. I mean, it's going to be dead. And you have to prepare them for that because it's not exactly pretty, and you have to let them understand that this is a process. And so it's a temporary setback for long-term gain. And so that bottom photo represents an area that was treated versus an area that wasn't treated. So this is all old world blue stem on the left versus native flowers and grasses that we seed drilled on the right. And so it'll come back. The biggest thing with herbicide application is time. So once we've sprayed, we're going to look at that site. We're going to see where it's at for seed application. And so if there's a lot of thatch on the ground, we're going to remove that thatch to try to expose that soil so that when we're putting seed in, we can maximize our seed to soil contact. We may even put livestock on the site to keep those cool season annuals short so that again, when we're ready to seed, we have that ability to get seed to soil contact. And if it deems it, we'll do another round of herbicide. We had a project in Gillespie County where we had bison on our project site, and we just kept the bison on there while we seeded, and it basically overgrazed that site, kept the cool season annuals. We pulled them off in late April, and when we pulled them off, everything started to grow. And then we're seeding late winter, early spring, depending on the weather. Normally the latest that we'll do seeding is May. And so when you're talking about native prairie restoration, a lot of times people will say the first year that they're going to sleep, the second year they're going to creep, the third year they're going to leap. In drier areas, that process can occur in iterations of 2, but around here, it's kind of that 3-year process. As you move into Big Bend or the Rolling Plains or Western Edwards Plateau, you can get into those kind of iterations of 2, but it depends on rainfall. This year, we had projects, first year growth looked like a second or even a third year growth on normal rainfall years. So this year was a phenomenal year. And if you're driving through most of Texas, you can see the abundance of vegetation. So when you plant, there's an order in which plants occur. And a lot of that has to do with the seed mix. So in restoration, there's this idea of using a cover crop to build soil back. And sometimes that can be done in multiple years where you're trying to, in like years 1 and 2, you're planting a cover crop. And then on year 3, you're going in and planting your native vegetation. You can rig your seed mixes so that on the first year, you get certain plants to come up, say Maximilian sunflower. So you can see this picture down here. That's Maximilian sunflower, 12 feet tall. And then we'll also put in green springletop just to get stuff up and growing that will help build that soil back. And then in the following years, you'll get more establishment for more of your desirable plants. Ideally, your first year, you're seeing rows of grass, and it'll look like a line of grass. If you see that, you're generally on the right start. Unfortunately, when you seed, that's not the end. You'll have to, following Each winter, you'll want to do some sort of cool season management practice, whether that be grazing or mowing. Otherwise, your cool season plants will grow real tall early on in the year, and then as it gets hot, they'll die and fall over, and they'll shade out a lot of your plants that you're trying to get up to come from seed. And then again, those exotics are going to keep showing up. And so we're just trying to keep those at a minimum while our native plants increase. And so that control can look like hand spraying with just a normal, 3-gallon sprayer, a whip sprayer, which is demonstrated on this tractor right here. And so a lot of times we're going to use that for Johnson grass. Johnson grass generally grows up taller than a lot of our native vegetation. And so it's a selective way of applying herbicide where you're dragging a wick over it. And as that Johnson grass rubs that wick, it's applying that herbicide, but it's not applying it to your native plants based on height difference. And then on areas where I had one project in Milam County where they had like 80% of their project site came back in Johnson grass that was 6 to 7 foot tall. We ended up using some very specific herbicides that target only Johnson grass. And so it just kind of, I hate to say this because it's kind of ambiguous, but it depends on the site. And the way that you're going to figure that out is you're just going to be out there and evaluate what's coming back. So while herbicide is one of the mechanisms for control, we can use some targeted grazing early on in the summer to control Johnson grass, but you got to have the ability to have livestock, and you got to have the ability to move those livestock once you've grazed all the Johnson grass. And then we kind of mentioned succession, and so on that succession continuum, when you've disturbed the soil, something is going to have to come back immediately to keep that soil covered. And sometimes that can be annual sunflower or woolly croton, and those can get tall enough that they'll prevent any of your planted plants from coming up. And so targeted mowing can actually allow your native plants to come up and set back those first response plants. And so, again, I hate to say it depends, but it's pretty site specific. When these plants are first planted, they're extremely delicate. We don't want to mow them, we don't want to graze them. You almost want to just walk away from the project and really kind of focus on that second year of trying to deal with any sort of follow-up applications. When prairies respond after being planted, a lot of times the plants are extremely robust because they're taking available of that space. Over time, as competition from other plants increases, those plants will settle down and kind of resemble more of kind of a native statue. A lot of, unless it's this year, you don't generally see Maximilian sunflower 12 feet tall. And so that'll settle down once competition increases. One of the most important things is keeping an eye on any sort of restoration project, whether it's a 1-acre pocket prairie or a 100-acre full-scale seed drill restoration project. The more you look at this process, the more you're going to learn from it, and the more you learn from it, the better your results will be. So this has been a kind of an ongoing conversation that I've had with landowners. You plant, it's almost like Christmas. You're looking forward to what comes up, and you have a drought. A lot of these native plants, they're native. They evolved with droughts. It will delay a restoration project, but you will eventually get those results when the rain comes. When you do get these droughts, those plants will almost go dormant, where they're not putting any sort of nutrients into their above ground growth, and they're putting the majority of their nutrients into root growth. And so this picture here would depict kind of that difference from drought to wet. So that's the same site, dry year to wet year, and you can see the pretty stark difference. And I generally think that we're in a constant drought with a few periodic floods. That seems to be kind of our pattern the last couple of years. It seems like every year around this time of year it's dry. Every year in May it's green. So you can kind of see these constant patterns. And so once you kind of get out of that converted state, right? Think that state in transition model where we had savannas, shrublands, woodlands, and then that converted grassland state. Once you get out of that converted state, you almost go back to the same management practices that you would use any other day. And so if you do have the presence of exotics, you can use a warm season fire. So this top picture on the left, you can see the left would be old world bluestem. The right, there's less of it, and so that was a warm season burn. Use cool season fire to decrease that and open up bare ground, which will increase the forbs. Rotational grazing to promote open ground to increase forbs. And then if you can't graze or do burning, mowing or haying is your next best option. So these are some projects for this year. So there are minute landscape features that will influence your growth. So this was a project over in Burnett County. We're out with the landowner and another Parks and Wildlife biologist. And it looked like somebody had thrown grenades across his project. And you would see these just random areas that had taller vegetation. Those areas happened to be where they had burn piles. And so you would see an increase in vegetation height in that burn pile. Another project over in Kerr County, this was working with NRCS, south of Kerrville. This pasture had like old terraces across it. And so we would see just stark differences in plant response depending on where it was along that terrace. And it's really weird to see a straight line in plant growth in nature. And so that was a learning opportunity for all of us in how berms and swells can influence plant growth when it comes to restoration projects. So I talked about photo points, so we're going to go through a few photo points and just appreciate them. Tried to kind of show some that have some positive responses. Unfortunately, not every project is a failure or is a success immediately, and so it takes a little bit of patience. So this is a project in Central Texas, started out with old world bluestem. We mowed it here. Yeah, so mowed it, we sprayed it between here and here. This site had a bunch of thatch on it, so the landowner raked it and then applied a cool season herbicide application. We sprayed it we planted it in March. This is June of 2023, August of 2023, and May of 2024. So you can see kind of that transition in vegetation types over time. So we went from exotic monoculture to more diversity. So this is a project over in Milam County. This was an old pasture that was planted in like hay grazer every year. We took it out of production based on the landowner's goals. So this was in September, April. We planted it here. So this was April of 2024, June of 2024, June of 2025. So you can see the amount of Johnson grass that's in there. This is the project that I talked to y'all that was about 80% Johnson grass. We used a very selective herbicide, and that was the response in September. So very good response. This is over in Mason County. This was an old peanut field. So you can see it was plowed ground before. You can see our Maximilian sunflower coming in, green springletop, buffalo burr. And then this past year, Less Maximilian sunflower, less springle-top, more forbs, more big blue stem, Indian grass, little blue. This is a project in Bell County. Started with KR blue stem. This was seeding, first year of growth, June and November. And then in this year, it went off because of our rains. Lots of rain, so we spent the last 5 years waiting on our projects to go, and this past year they seem to really progress. This is that same project in Milam County, different place. So September, out of production. We seeded here, first year growth, June of 24. And then we went to June of 25, and then June of 2025, or September of 2025. So this is in Bell County, cultivated agricultural fields. We had just hayed these sites. This is in 2023, the top photos, and this is September of 2025. And that was about a 100-acre project. So we went from hay, no diversity, no flowers, to that. And so that's about as good as you can ask for a restoration project. And so with that, grasslands are a part of a larger system. They vary by size, shape, species, and condition. They're continually in a state of evolution on that succession continuum. So bare ground to woods, trying to keep it somewhere in the middle of grasslands. They have to be maintained by implementing certain management practices, or they will revert back to woods. And then it depends on what you're dealing with. Are we dealing with a native grass pasture that's functioning already, or are we dealing with an improved grass pasture? And so this varies by site, requires a plan with specific goals. If you have patience, you'll get the reward. You are never done. There is no end. And so one of the most promising things and kind of the most rewarding things is working with private landowners and seeing the responses of their efforts. And so you notice the abundance of smiles because it's rewarding for these landowners that are putting in this much effort and getting that return. So if you're interested in looking at doing grassland restoration, your best resource is fellow landowners. I'm a great resource, but I'm just going to tell you what I've learned from other landowners. And so your best resource is other people practicing prairie restoration. And then Texas is 95% privately owned. If it wasn't for the landowners being interested in prairie restoration, I wouldn't get the opportunity to do this, so thank you. You notice the smiles, except I think he's kind of mad at Johnson grass. And then with that, I'll take any questions. All right, so we're going to have to repeat questions, so go ahead. Have I had any landowners flat out refuse to use Roundup? Or yes. So basically when we work with landowners with Parks and Wildlife, it's all based on the landowner's goals and what they're willing to do or not do. If they're not willing to use herbicide, we'll work with them on prairie restoration, not using herbicide. If they are on water, there are things you can do to kind of mitigate the potential issues of herbicide around water sources. But a lot of times I don't do a lot of the talking. I'll tell one landowner, you're interested in prairie restoration. I've got some landowners that are always available to talk to other landowners, and I'll put them together. We'll go out to that other landowner's property. We let them kind of talk, and yeah, but absolutely, we have landowners. There are definitely other alternatives. All the alternatives have side effects. Some of them may not be as successful in, you know, as short of a time frame. Some of them take longer, cost more, you know, require more economical investment. It's not a one size fits all for every landowner. But one thing I will say with this process is a lot of the landowners enjoy the success and the return. So that's kind of what gets people on this. Go ahead. Uh-huh. Yep. Yeah, so the question was, have I ever had a project use sheep or goats or cattle to get rid of an exotic grass? Yes. We've done that with bison, we've done that with sheep, we've done that with cattle. What I will say is that even though you overgraze it and you put that much pressure on it, those plants will still come back. And so we had a project that we planted last winter that overgrazed it. We planted it, they got all that rain. You go out there now and it's really hard to tell that we planted it. Those non-natives love the rain just as much as our native plants would. And so now we have seed in the ground and we're going to have to manage it to try to get those native plants to express themselves with those exotic grasses still being really tall. So yes, and I've done it with success too. I think it may work more on drier years when we don't get that rain and those non-natives can't jump up so fast. And so it's kind of this, so the question was, what time of year do you suggest that you graze? That's a hard question to answer because there's not a one size fits all. We've had them graze before herbicide application so that you graze that vegetation down, you pull them off and it's growing again, so it's taking in. We've also had it where they're not using herbicide, and so our goal is to get that site to zero vegetation growth or vegetative growth. So they'll put them on in May and keep them from May to December for a planting in January. You're just trying to you're trying to overutilize that landscape, and very rarely am I telling landowners to do that, but for that specific situation, we're trying to, you know, meet something to prepare for planting. Go ahead. Okay. So first question is, what is another name for Old World Bluestem? So KR Bluestem is a common name, but there's several different types of varieties and cultivars of Old World Bluestem. So Clayburgh Bluestem, Beadall Bluestem, Silky Bluestem. I think there's a book put out by AgriLife that talks about identifying all the different Old World Bluestems, but it's just kind of a categorical name. So the second question, what is the ideal composition of native grasses and forbs? That's a really nuanced question. It depends on basically the 5 W's: who, what, when, where, and how. So sometimes we'll have landowners that are more interested in bird hunting. So they're going to want more forbs because dove or quail are going to be more interested in flowers, versus some landowners are more interested in having grass because down the line they're wanting to put livestock on these restored pastures. You know, nature's not perfect, but you know, if you can have as many grasses as you can forbs, you're doing well. But you don't ever want all grass or all forbs. Yep. So what is the reason, so I'm going to repeat the question, what is the reason behind that transition from grasslands to woodlands? Think about my beard, right? So nature doesn't like to be a nudist. Grasses kind of go from, like, you know, shaving to then having a big and woolly beard. But it's just kind of that continual evolvement. So we call that state the climax state. And it's just the way the system has evolved. That system is always moving and towards, full coverage of vegetation at a woody level, and we're implementing management practices to set it back. It's dependent on rainfall. So this is, like I said, this is a very nuanced situation. And so, for the most part in Texas, there's some exceptions when you get into like the Balcones escarpment. We're a grassland system with woody vegetation encroaching. I would say that it's competition, and so with any species, they want to dominate, right? So we don't want diversity, we want to dominate. So mesquite have a unique thing where if you've ever been kind of in north central Texas, think Brownwood, San Angelo, you'll see these pastures that are just solid mesquite. So they're actually producing an allelopathic response that's preventing from certain plants from growing. And so a lot of times you'll see Texas wintergrass, and they're dominated by Texas wintergrass, and so that's kind of a mutualistic relationship. But most plants just want to dominate. Does that answer your question? So there is a thing. Go ahead. So I'm going to try and summarize that. Why are we restoring these pastures to meet certain objectives, whether it's hunting or grazing? So if we're trying, so remember when we were talking about that ecological site description? So that is based on historic findings that basically says this site was historically a native grassland with live oak, persimmon, agarita, or this site was a post oak savanna with post oak, Yopon holly coverage, right? If we don't, it's not about removing a specific tree, but we do live in a private land state, and so those goals are ultimately drivers. But we're working in lands that are, it's a square field with no trees. And so if you don't do anything once you've converted it back to a native site, it will go to woodlands. And so we're just trying to keep it in a grassland state. Go ahead.
We have some online questions.
Go ahead.
One is, do the herbicides that you use impact pollinators? Are they toxic to bees? Another one is, what's the least amount of acreage that you work with your clients with? And those are two.
Yeah, so the first one, immediately, like I said, we're taking a site and we're making it zero. So immediately, yes, there's impact to pollinators, but over time, that next year, when it's looking like this, I don't think so. Roundup is not glyphosate is not active in the soil. Its residence time in soil is really short. And so what I mean by active in the soil is it doesn't move through the soil. It's only active at the plant level. And so I think there are in the short term, but overall, I think it's worth the risk. And then the second
Question was the size of properties that you work with.
So specifically with restoration projects in that cost share program, because it's a pass-through project with Fish and Wildlife Service, their minimum is 20 acres. But within Parks and Wildlife, the smallest property that I work with is half an acre, or quarter acre. I work with Barrow Brewery, working on their riparian restoration on Salado Creek. So, any other questions? Go ahead. Uh-huh. So it goes back to grazing. So you don't want to remove 50% of so if you have a grass that's, let's just say, a foot tall, you don't want to remove you don't want to make it less than 6 inches tall. And the reason is when you make it less than 6 inches, you start damaging the roots. Go ahead, and I'll try to repeat the question. Uh-huh. Mm-hmm. Yeah, so she was referring back to the original question of why we're doing it. And yes, so if we're having to do some sort of woody management, that's because we've removed fire from that system. Yeah, so it's scale dependent, right? So, if a landowner has 100 acres, a tennis court may not necessarily be in the realm. But what I would say is, there are some landowners, you meet with them and they're like, I want to do my whole property. And you're like, okay, right? But generally I'm going to say, hey, let's not eat the whole pie at once. Let's buy off a little bit and be successful and then replicate that as we have successes. Yep. So yeah, so talk a little bit more about Johnson grass control. So Johnson grass is a non-native grass. It's pretty common throughout Texas. You can control it in the same way that you can control if you wanted to damage natives, you can damage Johnson grass in the same way. So you can routinely mow it. You can overgraze it with livestock. In a setting where you don't want to mow and you don't want to graze, there's herbicide specific to Johnson grass that you can target that will kill the Johnson grass but not the natives. And there is a 1-year kind of forb shock where you'll kill the flowers, but it's temporary. Generally at the point that you're using that herbicide, you don't have that anyways, because at the point that we're using that, you have 20 or 40 or whatever your property size is full of Johnson grass. Patchy, yeah, so what size? Okay. Uh-huh. Yeah, so just hand spraying it with Roundup. You can buy one of those wick sprayers that is like a hand wick sprayer. That's going to be the main thing. The unique thing about Johnson grass, and it kind of creates opportunities for management, is in May or June, it's taller than all the other native plants. So it's easy to identify. Watch out, you can misidentify that and confuse it with switchgrass. I've had people that have killed all their Johnson grass and it was switchgrass. So, but anyway, I think we're out of time. I'll be around if y'all have questions.